Computer. Hi, this is Nick Brabulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews we're doing with authors of papers that have appeared in the journal. Today's guest is Rebecca Taylor, who's just done a paper recently on normative case study methodology. It's part of a set of papers on normative case studies, and it's a really outstanding set of papers. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I have to tell you this paper is one of my favorites in the set. Rebecca, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Good. So let's talk about the normative case study methodology generally. I think partly because of the work of Mayor Levinson and other people, this has become a more and more popular approach within philosophy of education. And it's a different approach from some of the more traditional philosophical thought experiments or examples or cases that have been sometimes used in the field in the past. How is this approach different, and why is it becoming more important today?
Sure, yeah. So this is something I address in the paper, and part of it I'm kind of thinking about how are normative case studies distinct from other related tools like philosophical thought experiments and then also qualitative case studies, and comparing them to philosophical thought experiments. Some of the key distinctions that I think stand out are that others have also pointed to are kind of the relationship, or like where each falls on a spectrum from kind of pure fantasy on one side and pure reality, if that exists, on the other, and where philosophical thought experiments tend to often employ more kind of lean more towards the bizarre, and whereas normative case studies are really grounded in empirical context and real world scenarios, and often in the development of them that involves doing some review of either existing literature. It could involve doing some interviewing or some primary research to learn about the context that you would want to represent in the normative case study. So there are a variety of ways to go about it, but it's much more empirically grounded than traditional thought experiments. So that's one key distinction that I think stands out in thinking about them. And then another is kind of the way in which they vary in the complexity that's represented. I think more traditional uses of either like brief cases or thought experiments in philosophy tend to try to narrow in on one more narrowly defined question with, or concept, whatever that is, with that approach. Whereas in normative case studies, the way I think about it, and some others do, there's a lot of value in building in layers of complexity to the types of questions that are being raised with the normative case study.
Yeah, so that's great. That's very helpful. So you've just laid out really two axes, an axis from imaginary cases to more realistic or reality-based cases along, let's say, the x-axis, and then a y-axis of range from simplicity to complexity. And in your paper, you lay out these two axes and talk about the four quadrants that they define. Can you say a little bit more about how you use that framework to explain or account for different kinds of case studies?
Yeah, so in the paper, I also look at the relationship between normative case studies and qualitative case studies. And part of my motivation in thinking about that relationship is from concerns that have been raised among philosophers or philosophers of education about whether, if we're kind of moving in this more empirically grounded direction, is what we're doing distinct from what qualitative researchers are doing, and kind of what are those distinctions. And so in addition to thinking about the relationship with thought experiments, I use that kind of two-dimensional grid that you referenced to think about the relationship between qualitative case studies and normative case studies. And I do think they're both kind of situated more toward, they're both have like higher levels of complexity and are empirically grounded, but qualitative case studies, I think, kind of occupy a narrower range of the spectrum from like how empirically grounded they are to how much kind of fictionalization and kind of fantasy they might allow for, whereas normative case studies there's kind of a broader range that they could occupy. And then on the complexity front, I think what's distinct about normative case studies is that there's complexity both in the representation of the kind of physical and social reality that's informing the case, and then also in the like layering of normative dimensions in the case to facilitate normative theorizing, which is not a dimension of kind of focus so much in qualitative case studies.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful distinction. Thank you. So this typology, or this four quadrant structure, isn't just a descriptive framework. You also use it in part to describe what makes a good case study, or what makes it a better or more useful case study. You can say more about how the more evaluative part of your paper works in terms of what is a good case study, or how do we identify the features of a good case study?
Yeah, so in the latter part of the paper, I kind of use it as an opportunity to think about what makes a good normative case study. And in doing that, I looked at kind of thought about what are the quality criteria that inform both quantitative and qualitative research, and are there any insights that we could, as kind of philosophers using normative case studies, that we could pull on from those areas, but kind of came to thinking that we need independent quality criteria because we are doing something distinct. If normative case studies are distinct, then we need to think through what criteria would help us develop strong normative case studies, and how are those criteria distinct from the ones that might help you develop a strong qualitative case study. So in that part of the paper, I kind of introduce or suggest the idea of normative trustworthiness as a kind of overarching indicator of quality for normative case studies. And then I unpack that really briefly into four components that I think would be kind of all necessary indicators of normative trustworthiness in a qualitative case study.
Why don't you tell us what those four criteria are?
Sure. So they are normative credibility, and then perspectival authenticity, normative complexity, and normative applicability. I can say a little bit about each of those. So for normative credibility, I'm thinking about to what extent we should trust that the case study represents normative tensions that actually arrives in practice. So is this a credible representation, essentially, which has a clear kind of parallel to credibility and qualitative research, which is focused more, it's on focus on credibility in the empirical context, but here the focus specifically on the normative dimensions of that context that are being elicited through the way that the case is constructed. And then the second criterion of perspectival authenticity refers to the extent to which the normative perspectives that are presented actually reflect authentic perspectives that are held by either the people who are involved, if it's a nonfiction case, or by similarly situated folks in the case of fictionalized cases. So are those perspectives that are being included kind of authentically represented within the case? And then for the third criterion, normative complexity, that goes back to what I was talking about before with like multi-layered normative questions. So is there complexity represented in the case that brings out a variety of, I think about as important for cases to include both kind of more immediate action-oriented questions for the agents involved in the case, so it's kind of practical ethical decisions, but also broader structural questions of normative significance. And so kind of how are those different types of normative questions layered within the case? And then the final criterion that I propose is normative applicability, which speaks to how much the particular content addressed in the case is potentially applicable to a wide array of other contexts. So there might be cases that are kind of have some normative complexity and present authentic perspectives, and are presenting those in a credible way, but aren't necessarily of kind of significance or import more broadly. They might be somewhat idiosyncratic and not as strong in that sense in their applicability to a wide array of contexts. So those are the four that I suggest kind of, if you have all those together, bring them together, that you would have the most normatively trustworthy case study.
Yeah, thank you for that. So when I think about these four criteria, and this really broadens out the question a little bit, you don't really discuss this aspect very much in this particular paper. But when I think about your concern with sort of realistically grounded, situational, empirically based case studies with sort of a broad applicability, I can't help but see this in the context of some of your larger work, which is concerned with issues of social equity, justice, diversity, representation, and related sorts of issues that are, of course, very much on all of our minds right now. And it seems to me that at least in your own work, part of the appeal of the case study approach is it becomes a framework in which some of these very real world problems of equity and justice can be framed within a philosophical framework. How do you see the case study methodology related to some of these broader social and moral commitments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think you're right. And as far as my orientation to it, I think that I see this type of approach to case studies as one tool in bringing philosophical analysis, philosophy of education to bear on some of the most pressing, in my mind, normative issues that are happening, which are those that bear on like questions of equity, justice, inclusion in our educational spaces. And so I think the use of case studies is one way to really ground our thinking about the values that are at stake and how we move forward and advancing them in a way that's really engaging with what's happening in education, what social science researchers are understanding about what's happening in education, and kind of bringing philosophy of education more in conversation with just what's happening in the real world, and how we can be in better conversation with these discussions, both kind of with beyond the philosophical community as well.
Yes, well, thank you for that, Rebecca. It's good talking with you. I want to urge people to click through to the link and read the entire paper. We haven't discussed everything that's in the paper, but it's a really good paper and raises, I think, some much broader issues. It is part of a really outstanding set of papers on case study methodology, and thank you for making the time to talk with us today.
Yep, thank you.